Lone cowboy rescued, a native woman from drowning in the flood. Unaware of the consequences, the Pecos roared like a wounded beast that night. Rain hammered the canyon walls, turning dust into blood-colored mud. Thorn Avery pushed through the storm, the brim of his hat dripping, his lantern trembling in his hand. Then he saw it, a pale arm tangled in the reeds, limp against the raging current. He didn't think. The river swallowed him whole, its chill cutting through every scar and sin he'd carried. Fingers grasped fabric, then fleshlight. Weightless, dying, he dragged her to shore, coughing, half blind from the rain. Her skin was cold as stone, lips blue, wrists marked by rope. "Come on, breathe," he rasped, pressing his palms to her chest, forcing air into lungs that would not yield. And then, a faint gasp, one fragile sound against the roar of the storm. Thorn froze. For the first time in years, something had come back to life in his hands. By dawn, the storm had dragged its anger downstream, leaving the Pecos Basin wrapped in a silence thick as dust. The river ran slower now, swollen and brown, carrying torn branches and scraps of the desert it had devoured. Mist clung to the low limestone ridges. Ghost-like, Thorn Avery stood on the slope above it all, a tall, broad man in a sweat-darkened shirt, hair graying at the temples, the set of his shoulders carved by years of regret. His cabin crouched against the wind, 100 yards from the water. Built from cedar and patched tin, it was the kind of place a man went to disappear. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and ashes. A single bed, a forge, a row of traps and knives lined the wall, tools of a life stripped to its bare bones. On the table lay the woman he had pulled from the Pecos, wrapped in a blanket, her face half hidden beneath tangled black hair. He had seen death before too many times, but not like this, not so fragile. She looked carved from the same clay as the valley, sun-darkened skin, lips cracked, eyelids trembling at each breath. Around her wrist was a deep welt, where rope had bitten through the skin. A small necklace of river stones and colored beads rested against her collarbone. Thorn poured hot water from the kettle and wiped the grime from her arms. The steam rose between them, softening the lines of his weathered face. For a moment, her chest stilled and fear slammed through him again. Swift as lightning, he leaned close, listening, until the faint rhythm of breath returned. He straightened, pressing a hand to his eyes. It had been 10 years since he'd touched another living soul. 10 years since the firefight near the border, where a stray bullet from his rifle had torn through a girl who never should have died. She'd been Apache, barely 16. No one had blamed him. The world out here never cared for reasons. But Thorn had. Enough to bury himself in this wasteland, where every sunrise felt like punishment. He turned to the window. Outside, the land stretched in red and bone-white layers, mesquite bushes twisting in the wind, vultures circling the far ridge. Somewhere beyond those rocks, the world kept on killing and forgetting. He no longer belonged to it. A cough broke the silence. He spun around. The woman's eyes fluttered open, dark, wide, unmoored. Panic flashed through them. She tried to sit up, gasping in a language he couldn't understand. "Easy," he murmured, holding up both hands. "You're safe here." She shrank back against the wall, eyes darting to the door, then to the fire. The only words that escaped her lips came rough and broken. Men, rope, escape. Thorn froze. The storm outside had ended, but another quieter, more dangerous had just begun inside his cabin. For the rest of that morning, the cabin felt more like a trap than a shelter. The woman Ishta, he would later learn, watched every move Thorn made as though a single wrong step might summon her captors from the wind. He moved slowly, deliberate in everything, refilling the fire, hanging his soaked coat, scraping mud from his boots outside before coming back in. Each time he passed near her, her shoulders stiffened, The fear in her eyes wasn't just fear of him, it was fear of men, of any man. When he brought a bowl of broth, she didn't touch it. Only when he set it down and backed away did she crawl forward, sniff the steam, and drink in quick, trembling sips. Thorn stood by the door, arms folded, pretending not to notice the tears that mixed with the broth on her lips. He wanted to speak but didn't know what to say. His words had grown rusty from disuse, like the tools hanging on his wall. So he busied himself sharpening a knife, not because it needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. The sound of metal scraping against stone filled the silence. Ishta flinched at it, then turned her face away, whispering something he couldn't understand. Thorn paused. Slowly, he set the knife down. "You're safe," he repeated. Softer this time. "No one's coming." Her eyes flicked toward him quick, wary, assessing. She pointed toward the window, then mimed the motion of a whip across her arm. Her voice broke as she forced out the English words, "They, men, hurt." Thorn's jaw tightened. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not again." He gestured toward his own chest, then hers. "Thorn," he said. She hesitated, lips parted, then pressed a trembling hand to her heart. "Ishta?" The name was foreign and beautiful, like the low hum of wind through canyon reeds. He nodded. Once, as though sealing an unspoken truce. For hours, she drifted between sleep and fevered dreams. Once, she woke screaming in her native tongue, thrashing against the blanket. Thorn reached out on instinct, catching her wrists. She fought him with surprising strength until their eyes locked his full of alarm. Hers, burning with terror. "I'm not them," he whispered, voice rough, easy. "Now." She froze, chest heaving, and for a long moment neither moved. Then her hands fell limp in his grasp. He let go immediately and stepped back, ashamed of how his touch had frightened her. Outside, the afternoon light crept through the cracks in the wall, falling across her face. In that narrow beam, Thorn noticed details he hadn't before: the faint white scar along her temple, the dirt beneath her nails, the soft bruise along her jaw. She'd been beaten, bound, and left to drown. He poured her another cup of water, left it beside the bed, and retreated to the corner. When she finally drank, it was without fear. The silence stretched, but this time it wasn't empty. There was something else in it, a fragile understanding, perhaps, or the first flicker of trust. Later that evening, as the wind began to shift and the last streaks of sun bled out behind the ridge, Ishta spoke again. Her English was halting, but the meaning was clear. "You save me." Why Thorn didn't answer right away. He looked at his hands, still raw from the river, then at the fading light outside. "Because once," he said finally. "I didn't." The words hung between them, heavy, irrevocable, like the first stone laid on a bridge. Neither of them yet knew they were crossing. The days that followed passed in quiet rhythms, the kind that only the wilderness could teach. Each sunrise came pale and cold over the Pecos Basin, sliding gold light across the red rocks and the cabin's smoke-stained windows. Ishta grew stronger. The fever broke on the third night, leaving her skin damp and flushed. She spent long hours sitting near the hearth, wrapping herself in Thorn's old coat, watching the fire as though it held all the answers she needed. She spoke little. English came to her like pebbles tossed one by one into water slow, careful, uncertain. When she didn't know a word, she used gestures, tapping her chest to say, "I," pointing toward the door to mean outside, or placing her palm flat on her heart when she wished to thank him. At first, Thorn kept his distance. He spent the mornings mending traps, the afternoons repairing a broken fence, or cutting logs in silence. Yet even in that silence, something had begun to move between them, small, invisible threads spun out of simple kindness. When he returned from the river one evening, he found the floor swept clean and a pot of stew warming over the fire. Ishta turned, startled by his presence, then looked away quickly. Embarrassed. "You didn't have to," he said. She glanced up, a flicker of pride crossing her eyes. "Work? Good," she managed. "Stay helps forget pain." He nodded. "Ain't just you trying to forget." They ate together in silence, the smell of cedar smoke filling the air. For the first time in years, the cabin felt like something more than a shelter. It felt alive. Over the next week, their wordless partnership deepened. She began patching his torn shirts with sinew thread. He carved her a small wooden comb from mesquite wood. When she smiled at the gift, it startled him more than any gunshot ever could. Sometimes, when the light faded and they sat outside, the wind carried songs from far-off canyons. Ishta would hum softly old Apache melodies that rose and fell like the river's pulse. Thorn didn't understand the words, but the sound soothed something in him he thought long dead. One evening, as the sky blazed orange, she joined him by the corral. He was fixing a broken latch when she approached, holding the horse's reins with steady hands. "You teach?" she asked, motioning toward the saddle. Thorn hesitated. "You ever ride before?" She nodded once, eyes shining. He helped her mount, guiding her hand along the reins. When the horse shifted, she tensed. "Easy now," he said, his voice low. "He feels what you feel." For the first time, she looked directly into his eyes, not with fear, but with trust. It lasted only a breath. But in that moment, Thorn felt something break open inside him. Afterward, as twilight crept over the valley, he watched her ride a slow circle around the clearing. Her dark hair streamed behind her, catching the last light. She looked free, painfully, beautifully free, and he realized he hadn't seen freedom in years. That night, when he returned inside, she was sitting by the table, studying a scrap of paper and a half-broken pencil. She pointed at the marks she'd drawn. "You teach word," Thorn smiled faintly, sitting across from her. "All right then. Let's start simple." He wrote water, fire, home. She repeated them, lips shaping the sounds carefully. Then she pointed at herself. "Ishta," she said, and then at him, Thorn. He nodded. "That's right." She hesitated before asking. "Thorn" means he looked at the flickering firelight before answering. "A thorn's what sticks in your skin, small thing that hurts for a long time." Ishta tilted her head, thinking. "Pain remind, alive," she said softly. He looked up sharply. There was no fear in her voice now, only a calm certainty that unsettled him more than any accusation could. From that night on, their silence changed its shape. It was no longer heavy with mistrust, but alive with unspoken things, memories, gratitude, a quiet ache neither could name. Outside, the Pecos kept flowing, slower now, as if the river itself were listening. When Thorn finally slept, he dreamed of the girl he had killed long ago, only this time. She turned and walked out of the water alive, her face becoming Ishta's beneath the rising sun. By late summer, the Pecos shrank to a dull ribbon of mud and shimmer. Days grew hot, the air dry as rust. Thorn and Ishta had fallen into an uneasy rhythm, neither strangers nor companions. Something quieter, built from shared chores and silence. But silence never lasts long in Texas. Not in a place where men hunt both animals and other men. It started with the prints. Thorn spotted them at dawn. 3 sets of horse tracks cutting through the dust behind the ridge. Heavy riders, not traders, not wanderers. The trail led straight toward the basin, then vanished in the rocks above the cabin. His stomach turned cold. He returned to the house, trying not to let his boots crunch too loud on the dry earth. Ishta was inside grinding herbs. Her sleeves rolled past her elbows. She looked up, saw his face. and froze. What she asked quietly. Tracks, he said. 3 horses came from the north. Her hands trembled, scattering the dried sage. The English words left her mouth slow and broken. But her fear needed no translation. They, men, Jeb, Royce, Crow. The names hit like hammer blows. Thorne knew them all. Jeb Calloway had once ridden beside him during the border wars, before greed hollowed the man out. Royce Dunn and Mason Crow were hired guns, the kind who laughed while tying a noose. Thorne checked his rifle, the same Winchester that had cost him his soul a decade ago. You sure they're after you? Ishta nodded, eyes dark as the storm clouds building in the east. I run. They follow. They always follow. He looked toward the window, where winds stirred the mesquite. Then they'll find a fight waiting. She caught his arm. No. You helped me once. Enough. I go. He turned sharply. Go where? They'll hunt you through the whole basin. You step 1 mile out that door. You're done. Her chin lifted. Then I'd be standing. Not hide. For a long moment they stared at each other, the air between them thick as thunder. Then Thorne exhaled through his teeth. You stay. I'll deal with them. That evening, the riders came. Dust rose behind their horses. 3 dark shapes cutting across the pale horizon. Jeb was in front, hat tipped low. The same smirk Thorne remembered. He called out before dismounting. Well, I'll be damned. Thought the Pecos done swallowed you. Avery. Not yet, Thorne replied, leaning against the post, shotgun in hand. Jeb's eyes slid past him to the cabin door. Heard tell you're hiding a little Apache girl. Folks don't take kindly to that. Thought I'd come collect her proper. Royce spat a stream of tobacco. Could fetch a good price south of the border. Thorne's hand tightened on the gun. You boys rode a long way to make a mistake. Jeb chuckled low. You already made yours years ago. Now you're playing save your hell. I saw what your bullet did back then. That sentence your bullet sliced open an old wound. Thorne felt his pulse hammering behind his ribs. Shame, mixing with fury. He stepped forward. If you know what happened, you know. I don't miss twice. For a second, nobody moved. Then Jeb's grin broke. We'll be back when the sun's up. You think on that? Hero. They turned their horses, leaving dust curling in their wake. Inside, Ishta had heard every word. When he entered, she stood near the fire. Yavset. They come again. They will, Thorne said, and we'll be ready. He handed her his old revolver. She weighed it in her hand, testing the balance, then looked at him. I stay. He wanted to argue, but the look in her eyes silenced him. That night, she helped him stack ammunition, oil the guns, and lay out a plan. She sprinkled ash and sand near the door to hide their tracks, then whispered something in Apache, a prayer, or a warning. The storm broke at dawn. Thunder rolled over the valley as the first shot cracked through the rain. The cabin shuddered. Thorne ducked low, firing through the window. A bullet smashed into the frame above his head. He saw Jeb crouched behind a boulder, Royce flanking wide, Mason circling from the rear. Stay down, he shouted. But Ishta was already moving, crawling toward the back door, her body close to the ground. She slipped out through the side where smoke curled and vanished behind the rocks. Thorne's shoulder burned a grazing hit, but he held position. He picked off one of Royce's shots clean, heard a curse, then the sound of a body falling. Minutes stretched like hours. The rain turned the dirt into red sludge. Mason appeared on the ridge, aiming down at the cabin. A shot rang out. Not Thorne's, and Mason pitched forward, his rifle spinning into the mud. Through the mist, Thorne glimpsed Ishta standing on the slope, drenched, her braid undone, revolver trembling in her hand. Then a scream, Jeb's, followed by another volley. A bullet tore into Thorne's shoulder, spinning him to the ground. His rifle clattered away. He tasted blood, saw flashes of lightning, and through the blur, Ishta running toward him. She dropped beside him, pressing her hand to the wound. "You not die," she whispered, voice fierce, command-like. "You hear me, Thorn? Not now." He tried to speak, but the words drowned under the roar of the Pecos rising again behind them. Jeb stumbled closer, blood streaking his arm, rage twisting his face. "You should have stayed buried, old man." Before he could raise his gun, Ishta fired. Once, the echo rolled through the gorge, swallowed by thunder. Jeb fell backward into the current, the river claiming him like every sin this land refused to bury. Ishta dragged Thorn toward the cave at the base of the ridge as rain poured down, washing away footprints, blood, and the last trace of the men who had come to kill. When the storm finally passed, only the sound of water remained. The cave was narrow and damp, hidden behind a curtain of ivy that dripped with rainwater. They stumbled inside, breathless and soaked, the storm still grumbling beyond the walls of stone. The air smelled of wet earth and ash. Thorn collapsed against the cold rock, blood soaking through his torn sleeve. Ishta tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it hard against the wound. He winced, teeth clenched, but said nothing. She worked quickly, the way someone once trained in care might, her hands steady even as her chest rose and fell with fear. "Bullet passed through," she murmured, examining the gash. "You live." Thorn gave a dry, breathless laugh. "You sound awful sure." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her pouch, pulling out crushed leaves and a small tin of salve she'd made from herbs. The scent sharp and bitter, like sage and smoke, filled the small space. She smeared it gently over the wound. When she finished, she sat back against the opposite wall, both of them silent, except for the slow drip of rainwater from the cave mouth. "You shouldn't have come back for me," he said after a while. His voice rasped, rough from blood and regret. "You could have run." Ishta's gaze lifted to his face. In the half-light, her eyes looked darker than ever deep, unwavering. "You saved me first," she said. "River, take me. You pull me back. I do same." Thorn swallowed. That river's got a cruel sense of humor. Ishta didn't smile. Instead, she reached into the small leather pouch she always carried close to her chest and drew out something, a strand of beads. Worn, smooth, with time. Blue glass. Bone. And one carved white stone in the center. She turned it in her fingers for a long time, then looked up at him. "Yours," she said softly, placing it beside him on the cave floor. Thorn stared at it, his breath catching in his throat. He knew those beads. He had buried them himself. For a moment, he couldn't speak. When he finally did, the words scraped out raw. "That belonged to her. The girl He stopped, unable to say it. Ishta waited, patient as stone. "The girl I shot," he whispered. 10 years ago, near the border. Raid gone wrong. She was running. I never meant to." His voice broke. "God help me. I never meant to." Her expression didn't change, though her eyes shimmered in the firelight. "She was my sister," she said simply. The cave seemed to shrink around them, the silence pulsing with old ghosts. Thorn turned away, unable to meet her gaze. "Then say it," he rasped. "Say you hate me. Say I deserve it." For a long time, Ishta said nothing, only the sound of the river outside rushing, endless, indifferent. When she finally spoke, her words came slow and deliberate, as though each one carried weight. "Hate, eat heart," she said. "Make river inside. I tired of drowning." He looked up, startled. She went on, her voice steadier now. "Sister gone. You carry pain. I carry pain. Maybe river take her. Give me you. Maybe not to punish but to clean." Thorn's eyes burned. He shook his head, voice breaking. I don't deserve that kind of mercy. Ishta moved closer, kneeling beside him. No man deserve, she said, touching her hand lightly to his chest. Mercy is not gift for good man. It for broken one. For a long time, neither spoke. The storm outside faded into a soft drizzle, and the cave filled with the faint smell of wet sage. He finally whispered, "You sound like someone who's forgiven more than she should have had to." Ishta smiled faintly. The first trace of warmth since the rain began. "Forgive not mean forget," she said. "Forgive mean live." She leaned her head against the wall beside him, eyes half closed. They sat that way until the first pale light of morning crept across the mouth of the cave. When Thorn stirred, she was already awake, staring toward the river. He followed her gaze. The water glimmered silver under the dawn. Calm now, no longer raging. She rose and walked to the edge, pulling the strand of beads from her pocket once more. She free now. Ishta murmured, "But river not done yet." Thorn stood, slow and unsteady, his shoulder bound tight with the cloth she'd used. He watched as she held the necklace out over the water. "Wait," he said quietly. Let me say something." She nodded. "I spent 10 years trying to forget that face," he said. 10 years running from what I did. But today, standing here, I think maybe I'm supposed to remember. So I never pick up that gun for hate again." Ishta's lips trembled, but she didn't speak. Together, they knelt at the river's edge. Her fingers opened, and the beads slipped away, catching the sunlight as they drifted downstream. Neither of them moved for a long while. Then Ishta whispered something in Apache, soft, like a lullaby. Thorn didn't ask what it meant. He didn't need to. The river was answering for both of them. Autumn crept slowly into the Pecos Basin, softening the hard edges of summer. The grass, dry and yellowed, bent beneath the wind. The sky, once a harsh, endless white, turned wide and blue, as though the land itself had decided to rest. The flood had left its mark. Fallen trees and carved gullies traced where the storm had raged. But at Thorn Avery's cabin, smoke rose steady again from the chimney, the boards patched, the door rehung. The rhythm of life, quiet and deliberate, had returned. Thorn's shoulder healed poorly, stiff and aching when the air turned cold. But he never complained. Each dawn he'd step outside to breathe the desert wind, listening for the sound of the river beyond the ridge. It no longer roared, it murmured, low and constant, like something tamed. Ishta stayed, not because she owed him, and not because he asked. She stayed because one morning, as she packed her few belongings, she saw him kneeling at the edge of the riverbank, hat in hand, head bowed, whispering something she couldn't hear. When he rose, there was peace in his shoulders, and she knew then that her leaving would not erase what they had both begun to mend. Life in the basin found its rhythm again. She wove baskets from dried yucca, traded them with riders passing through for coffee and salt. He hunted small game, mended tools for the few ranchers who dared cross this barren stretch. Some evenings, they'd sit on the porch together, watching the sun slip behind the limestone cliffs. She would hum the old songs of her people. He would listen with eyes half closed, as if afraid to break the sound. There were no promises between them, only the slow, quiet comfort of two souls, learning how to exist without fear. One evening, after the first frost, Ishta stood by the river, her shawl drawn tight. The water glimmered pale gold beneath the dying sun. Thorn joined her, his boots crunching softly in the frozen grass. For a long while, they didn't speak. "The river's lower," he said finally. "Never thought I'd see it calm again." Ishta nodded. "River, like heart," she said. "When storm pass, still carry memory, but it flow anyway." Thorn smiled faintly. "You always turn simple words into scripture." She tilted her head. "And you always think guilt make you holy. That made him laugh a low, rough sound, rare and real. Maybe we're both wrong, he said. Maybe that's what makes us right. The wind carried the scent of mesquite smoke and faraway rain. Ishta reached down and scooped a handful of river water, letting it run through her fingers. When I first come here, she said quietly, I think Pecos want me dead. But now, her gaze drifted toward the horizon. Now it sound different, softer. Maybe it finally forgave us. Thorn murmured. She turned to look at him. No. Thorn. River. Never forgive. Riverwash. You choose what to let go. He met her eyes then, the same eyes that had once burned with fear. Now steady and deep, as the earth itself. And you, he asked, what have you let go? She hesitated, then stepped closer until they stood within the same shadow. Hate, she said, and you, he swallowed hard, running, for a heartbeat. Neither moved. Then, slowly, he reached for her hand. Her fingers were cold, calloused, but she didn't pull away. The touch was small, human, imperfect, and yet it felt like a prayer answered. They stood that way until the light dimmed and the first stars blinked awake. The Pecos whispered below, carrying its long song to wherever rivers go when the world forgets them. Months later, travelers passing through the basin would sometimes speak of what they saw, a weathered cabin near the bend of the Pecos, smoke curling from its chimney. Outside it, two figures often walked, side by side, a tall white man with silver hair and a woman with braids dark as night. They said the pair spoke little, but always paused by the water, as if listening for something only they could hear. No one knew their story, not fully, but some swore that when the wind was right, you could hear a woman's voice singing in a language older than the desert, and a man's low murmur answering it. And there, under the endless Texas sky, life began again. The river had taken, and the river had given back. If this tale of the Pecos moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. We post new Western stories here every day, quiet, human, and true. Saddle up with us tomorrow for another chapter of redemption under the wide Texas sky. Your support keeps these trails alive.